to the Logosphere.
Hello, good evening.
This is Chris Stites here, as always, with J.D. Roof.
Hello, hello.
And this evening, recently we talked about Nietzsche and played with the idea of Nietzsche ruining sobriety, the idea that certain principles that people adopt who are trying to live a sober, recovered life might be in conflict with some of the ideas that Nietzsche put forward, sometimes in very harsh conflict. And I think we've continued to play with this idea that might be interesting to very few people out there in the world besides us, but it's endlessly fascinating to us.
Right, because we've had to, it's funny, it's experiential. You have to incorporate certain values in your life. You have to almost exchange them for other values, right? And when you do, there's this promise that it's going to get better. Even if it gets worse, you'll be able to deal with life, and you're not going to have to ingest drugs and alcohol into your body, because if you adopt these virtues and these principles, it will get better.
And
much.
Live by these principles.
Live by these principles. Yeah, like drip with them.
Apply them to your life.
So I think
not just think about them and talk about them.
Right. And so we kind of were thinking, why don't we go through like 12 different principles, or try to keep it within certain principles, and then try to cross-examine what we think Nietzsche would take on it. So our interpretations might be a little wonky, but we both have read Nietzsche a lot, and we enjoy reading him, and we also hate reading him. So we'll start with the first kind of principles are personal powerlessness. And what would he never, in my readings, I've never seen Nietzsche ever talk about personal powerlessness.
First, maybe we should define what so we're talking about 12-step philosophy. Yeah,
12-step philosophy.
And what is meant there by personal powerlessness and how that relates to sobriety.
Yeah, why don't you walk us down? It's basically like a step one principle.
Yeah, well, the first step in the 12 steps is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol or drugs or whatever, usually whatever the 12-step fellowship is. They fill in the blank right there. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable.
Right.
So the first step is this sort of admission of a problem, a very deep problem. Powerlessness points at one of the kind of deepest dilemmas that there could be. Some people, I've heard this idea of, it's like dancing with a gorilla. The gorilla decides when the dance is over. That really to be powerless over something like drugs and alcohol, it completely eliminates the ingredient of choice in the matter.
So you'll hear that in the sober communities, like, I lost the power of choice.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're getting at. You're dancing with this gorilla. It is a dance. You could probably stop dancing at any time, but you really can't.
You could stop for a minute. You could run to the ropes, but as long as the gorilla wants to keep dancing, you're done. You're done. You're dancing.
You're almost possessed by it, too.
Yeah.
I like it as you're almost possessed by, almost like an evil spirit. I mean, we wouldn't use those terms in today.
Yeah.
Right. But almost like it's like the devil's possessed you in a weird way.
And it's, one of the paradoxical things I think about the way the 12 steps approach the problem is this idea that it is first through the admission of powerlessness that one starts to regain power.
Right.
And then later on within the whole 12-step deal, they sort of summarize their way of thinking about the whole issue as lack of power being the dilemma, and that the point of the 12-step process is to find a power that will solve the problem, solve our problem. And some people can interpret that in different ways, I think, whether it's the drink problem or the drug problem or the self-centeredness problem, the existential problem.
Existential angst.
Yeah. And I think that, then it gets into, you can get into a whole free will conversation when it comes to powerlessness. People like to debate over, is it just powerless over drugs, alcohol, and then you can just keep sliding the scale. Is it,
But one thing that you did point out that is another thing I don't think we want to skip is the idea of honesty, because admitting, right? That's kind of the first thing we admitted.
Yeah, there's a couple things that we could pick apart and to contrast with Nietzsche. One is the we, We. Some people like to emphasize that it's a we program because it starts with that word.
Right.
And as you mentioned in the intro, ultimately it's the idea that there's an adoption of principles that are already there. Right? They're already figured out. They don't have to be self-legislated, as Nietzsche would say. Right?
Right.
They're something that someone else says this is what you should do, and then so you do them and apply them to your life. That's the we part.
Right.
You know, which in the 12-step thing they would say, like, you know, it's a we program, we do it together, we don't do it alone. And then to the extent that Nietzsche emphasizes the importance of individuality, there would be one point of discussion to be had there. Admitted is what you talked about, which deals with honesty and self-honesty.
Right.
I think Nietzsche would be...
And self-diagnosis.
Yeah.
Because it's we admitted we were powerless, not you have to admit you are powerless over drugs and alcohol. It's we did. We do it at a group. And that's an interesting, realm to get into because it's self-diagnosis. It's not a therapist or a doctor or a lawyer or a judge saying, you are an alcoholic, you have this malady, you need to go get treatment. Even though they still do that. I mean, there's still court-ordered drug programs.
Yeah.
I mean...
It is a diagnosis in the DSM.
It is, in the DSM-5, right?
But in order for it to make sense within that framework, it requires a self-diagnosis first. I don't know, because
like pointing fingers, like you don't.
I mean, there's also some people that would disagree with that. They would say that the 12 steps work even if you don't think they're going to work. That they're not for the people who want it or believe in it. They're just for the people who do it.
Right.
And just by monkey see, monkey do. Just by taking the actions, it begets a certain result, regardless of what your mindset is.
Okay, because so
and
honesty.
I don't necessarily agree with that.
Right. I don't really have an opinion. It's kind of a murky thing. I do think that if it wasn't we, it might get a little weird. But you kind of say I. You say I when you're doing the first step.
Some people probably read too much into that. It's just
I definitely do.
The big book of Alcoholics Anonymous is, it's this book that technically has no author to it. Bill W.
Kind of like the Bible.
Bill Wilson, of course, is the most notable founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, and then Dr. Bob was his, he was the Engels to Bill W.'s Marx.
Don't go down that route. He definitely was the
He
Engels.
was, though, right?
Yeah,
he was the Engels.
Yeah.
But then, the big book, the way that they frame it is it's like we 100 people.
Wait, he was the Stalin to his Lenin? Or is Lenin to his Stalin?
I think Bill W. was more of a Stalin, honestly, and Lenin was more of a... Bob was more of a Lenin. He was more even though Bill came first, but temperamentally.
Yeah, temperamentally. He was more of a philosophize with a hammer type. Yeah, that's funny. This is interesting. Would Bill Wilson be considered an Ubermensch? He was able, his program, him and Bob.
I think so. I mean,
were able to bend the wills of millions.
They were able to, ultimately, this idea that, will to power, we're jumping around a lot.
I know. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no,
it's just
I mean, how else are we going to hit at this?
Yeah.
Will to power, which is, I guess, Nietzsche's crowning
jewel.
Yeah, that's his sort of explanation.
What's your I think you might have a better interpretation of what that kind of means. It's descriptive, right?
Descriptive. People think of Nietzsche as being more descriptive than prescriptive.
Right.
Whereas the 12 steps would be considered more prescriptive than descriptive, depending on how you read it.
Right.
You're
right. Yeah.
It's like, this is what you should do.
This is the medicine, take it. Yeah.
Here's the practice to take, where Nietzsche was not about, it wasn't a self-help program.
Right.
It was really just him trying to describe what he thought was going on.
Right. So will to power.
Yeah, so will to power, as time went on, he more and more started to develop this idea of will to power. I can't remember what book it was where he first...
Well, it's tethered in a lot of his work.
Yeah, but it wasn't, I think it was until the back 9 of his work that he really got into first coined the term will to power. And then it became the last book of his that was put together posthumously was called Will to Power.
Right.
But this idea that that we have a lot of different wills. A will is a drive. It's a motivation to do something. But that he thought will to power was the ultimate drive, and every other drive could be subsumed by will to power.
So this is, would you say it would be a metaphysical case? Like you cannot not have will to power.
Correct.
Right? Like there's even the idea of will to will and then will to power. Like
even a effort at, it's almost like atheism, a belief in the non-existence of God is still a belief in something. It's within the will to power, it's set up that it's hard to really get around. And even so, then when it gets into 12-step stuff, or just with Nietzsche, he thought that everyone was subject to the will to power, whether you were just a pathetic, like slobbering bum, or you were a Bill W. or a Karl Marx or a Jesus of Nazareth.
Right.
Everyone still was driven by the same thing, which was he differed from, for instance, Charles Darwin, because Charles Darwin thought that the will to survive was the ultimate will. And what Nietzsche pointed out is that people will often, and he used Socrates as a good example for this. Right. Socrates took the hemlock because Socrates was more motivated by the will to power than the will to survive.
Okay.
And so he would have seen, at the top of the food chain, as far as the will to power is concerned, there would have been, there's the slave morality, the master morality.
Right.
So even within the master morality, and of course those are controversial concepts, master morality domain, he saw these different types of, and the three that he thought were the highest were the artists and the philosophers and the saints.
Right.
Or the religious people.
Right.
And so then within that, in the genealogy of morals, he writes the third essay really has to do with the description of the ascetic ideal or ascetic values. So an ascetic is someone who renounces things. And so within, the 12 steps, it's a spiritual life. It's a life aimed at attaining the utmost humility of being as subservient to God. But ultimately, he would argue that that's being done. It's still a
will to will.
Yeah.
And even trying to adopt something like humility is really just even if you're just a bum on the street, you've willed that. Like you've been a part of that. You've been a co-creator in that. And it doesn't matter if you're a billionaire or a bum. Yeah. Right. It's just the will to power.
And he would see within a bum, he would see things like evoking pity out of other people as a way to actually inflict pain on them.
Right.
It's a power that you have, is this ability to make people feel sorry for you is actually like a semi-violent act. It's an assertion of power over others.
Right.
And that would be a very low resolution, still a will to power. And then at a much higher level, you have things like the philosophers. So Bill W., I think, would qualify maybe not as an artist so much, but as a philosopher and as an ascetic.
Right.
But as a philosopher, I think someone like Socrates, he would say he took the hemlock. It wasn't a will to survive that was the biggest motivator. It was a will to power.
Right.
And what he did through his life, more than his writing even. So Plato was the guy who wrote down most of what we consider to be Socrates' thinking.
Right.
But Socrates was he was like a living philosopher.
Yeah.
But still through his life, he arguably bent the trajectory of mankind as we know it in a profound and meaningful way.
Right.
And in the same way, Bill W. has arguably had the same impact. And that because of that, I think Nietzsche, I don't think Nietzsche was ever kind of being like Ubermensch, not Ubermensch.
Right.
But
we like to do that because it's like a fun term.
It is, yeah.
Superman, that's another interpretation of it. Like, who's the Superman?
Yeah.
And there's countless philosophers. I mean, even like Osho, Right. He's a philosopher, right? That, the Wild Wild Country.
Yeah.
And if you've never seen that documentary, go watch it. I think it's fantastic. But he read a couple Nietzsche books, took a couple philosophy classes, and interprets in a way that, oh no, there's a way that you can be an Übermensch. He actually says that.
Yeah.
And that's not what Nietzsche is really saying. He would say it's not possible.
But I think enlightenment, nirvana, the kingdom of heaven on earth, these type of states, I think ultimately the way it would line up with what Nietzsche, and I guess within the 12 steps, it would be the fourth dimension, right?
The fourth dimension, yeah.
There's this idea of an attainment of a state of mind and existence that is ideal and probably is somewhat in line with what Nietzsche, was putting forward with the self-overcoming Übermensch.
Right. Well, so now going back to step one with the cross-examination. So this is a question. Do you think Nietzsche would look at this idea of personal powerlessness, right? Like you're dancing with this gorilla and you just can't get off the ride. He's got you in the ring, right? It doesn't matter. You can run, you can hide. It's going to get you. And so that's alcoholism and drug addiction. Now, would he say that there is not a lack of power? That's not your dilemma. Your dilemma is maybe too much power, or it's a power in the negative sense towards life denial. You know what I mean? You get what I'm getting at? Like,
I think it's like
it's kind of semantics, I feel like, but
there's the idea of a lack or a will to power is applicable regardless,
no matter what.
But there's a will to power that comes as an overcompensation from a lacking, and then there's a will to power that is the result of an overflow. So he almost kind of had this idea that there were these two states, which I think would line up with the slave and master morality concepts as well.
Right.
But I think if you wanted to try to line it up with the 12 steps and the way they put it forward, that when we're newly sober, when we're coming to step one, we're busted up.
Right? And we're slave morality.
Right.
We're slaves to our morality.
Yeah.
Which is actually kind of true. Right.
We're slaves to the substance. Our whole life is outside of our control.
Right.
But a newly sober alcoholic or a not sober alcoholic, you can see that sort of that. And the other thing, if you were to look at slave morality, Nietzsche was a big, he was a pioneer. And that's why he was such a influence on on Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalytic movement.
Carl Jung,
because he saw things and he went like, I see what you're really up to.
Right.
You say you're out there and you're a charitable, well-intentioned guy, but ultimately what you're mostly driven by is resentment, and you just want.
Right.
It's like if you wanted to line it up with the social justice warrior thing, the proposed motivation is it's caring for the dispossessed and those who go without. But the hidden motivation is really a resentment for the people who have more.
Right.
And I'm going to say that I'm out here, I'm a cheerleader for the poor.
Right.
If you wanted to I get myself in trouble.
Well, but he would say the same thing about like the alt-right too, though.
Yeah, the alt-right, same deal.
Same thing, just a different side of the pendulum, right?
Yeah. He would see all those fools as basically just charlatans who are,
driven by resentment.
They are not they are not artists, they are not saints, they are not philosophers.
Right.
They might be somewhere in the middle there. They might not be complete putrid wrecks. But regardless of where you are, will to power is the deal, but I think if you would look at the powerlessness that we experience, that someone who's doing the steps experiences early on, I don't know. In the 12 steps, I think they have this idea which you could criticize, which is sort of like the old self and the new self, the old character and the new character.
The character I brought here.
Yeah,
right.
And so with character defects, there's this, we could again jump around, but this idea of self-overcoming, there's an analysis.
And that's a Nietzschean thing.
There's an analysis of our character.
Right.
And if you want, and then people start to bring it into the kind of New Age movements, but there's this idea of like a false self and a real self.
Or a higher self and a lower self.
And they were really trying to shed the false self, and that the real self is sort of already there.
It's all underneath there. It's that still small voice deep down inside of you that every man, woman, and child has this fundamental belief.
It may be obscured
God,
by pomp, calamity, worship of other things, but inevitably, if we keep searching deep down within us,
it's there.
It's there already, established.
Right.
It doesn't have to be produced.
It's innate.
It's
innate.
Yeah.
And we cloud it up with our egos and our bad characters.
All this other stuff.
Yeah.
So then that kind of gets into there's who are the two? I don't know this one very well. It's like Hobbes and Rousseau or something like
State of Nature.
And there's the idea of the constrained and unconstrained views of the world. Rousseau believed essentially that nature was perfect as it was, and that
state of nature,
and that we sort of corrupted it. And if we would just go back to the state of nature, everything would be idyllic and perfect and great.
Right.
And then the Hobbes, and I might be getting Hobbes wrong in this kind of thing that gets thrown around a lot, but the idea is that actually nature is hostile and
terrifying.
That it's only through the process of civilization and through like temperament that we take something that is ultimately violent and horrific and turn it into something that is habitable.
Right.
And of course they're extremes, and it's probably a mix of both of those things.
Right.
And that could lead us into another.
Well, that could lead us into Hegel and this idea. All the existentialists as well.
And also Nietzsche as his first book, Birth of Tragedy. He really deals with he was a classicist, and this idea of the Dionysus and Apollo there's these two approaches to art, the Dionysian and the Apollonian, and that it's kind of like this dichotomy or this dialectic of these two, in which are essentially line up to like the chaos and order. Dionysus is creative, it's chaos.
Right.
It's not intellectual. It's not reasoned or thought out.
Yeah.
Passion. But it's wild.
Yeah.
And then the Apollonian is the one that is sort of restrained and ordered and reasonable and intellectual. And so he plays with those ideas.
Yeah, I almost feel like if he lived now, he might. I'm sure he would have a lot of critiques over the 12-step philosophies, but I also think that he would probably give like an attaboy to some of it, right? Like he would probably say, well, here's some people going from a state of incomprehensible demoralization, because if you've ever been in the rooms of any kind of sober 12-step type of work, whether it's NA, AA, whatever, right, sex SLA, all that stuff, you see transformations happen. And I feel like the point of the kind of the enlightened philosophers of Nietzsche was what, in the 1800s, right? He was late 1700s all the way to the 1900s.
Late 1800s.
Or late 1800s, right. Their whole thing was everybody was trying to kind of and he said this, everybody's trying to kind of one up each other.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I think that's the critique you would make as far as the transformations, that a lot of what happens in a 12-step community is professed transformations. I've experienced God. I've had this psychic change.
Come follow me.
Yeah, come follow me. And also, it's all just flexing. Everyone is just, everyone is using this idea that I've been touched and anointed by this like supernatural entity,
right,
as these claims to power.
Right. Yeah. So that's why I think it's so difficult with him, because again, also getting onto the point where he's more descriptive, not And
I think that he would also ultimately say, even if that's what's happening there, that's still a fairly high form of will to power.
A higher form than lower forms.
Yeah. He would again, a descriptive rather than prescriptive. He would see that, and he would describe it maybe that way, which to my first reading of Nietzsche really came off as like, just because he's a polemicist, he's just he criticizes everything.
Right.
There's no
nothing can hide.
There's
from
no
Nietzsche.
safe place to hide from him. Yeah,
it doesn't matter.
But I think you would also feel that is ultimately, regardless of the inauthenticity you might claim that type of position of having, since the will to power is inevitable, it's like that's a pretty high iteration or form of will to power.
Right. And maybe a step away from like a slave morality will to power to a higher functioning human being.
Definitely.
And giving you the ability to have more effect in the world.
Yeah.
Because when you're groveling drunk, you're not going to do much.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but the funny thing is with Nietzsche, I always felt like if you were like some drunk, crazy, drug addict artist that made some great art, he'd be all for you. He'd probably be like, you found some new way, bro.
Yeah, I think he would. I think, in the 12-step, in the rooms, they would say, as long as, if you're an alcoholic, as long as you're still in your cups, you're not doing anything worthwhile in the world.
Right.
He would probably point to a lot of artists and philosophers and politicians who were unquestionably not sober, active addicts and alcoholics, and nonetheless would have been, for lack of a better term, ubermenches.
Yeah, like Jackson Pollock.
Jackson Pollock,
yeah.
Winston Churchill,
known alcoholics.
Yeah, Ernest Hemingway. So these people that have had this massive influence on culture, on this world socio-politically, whatever, and they were sauced out.
And all the the stuff we were talking about in prior shows with the Eleusinian mysteries and taking psychedelic stuff, and maybe that's the reason the stone eighth hypothesis where our brain developed faster because we came across some magic mushrooms and that kind of woke us up from sleeping or something as animals. Yeah, so he wouldn't allow it to close it.
I think there's an idea that is sometimes, I don't know, with the first step, powerlessness over, some people really, it's like I always have no power, right? It's this perpetual state, and this is where when it comes to the 12 steps, there's like smart recovery, rational recovery.
Right.
There's these alternative fellowships that have cropped up in part because they want to try to have a recovery program that doesn't involve anything that could be like even borderline theological.
Yeah, there's a rejection it's funny that you say that, because that's I feel like in like a more secular society that's kind of trying to move away from religion, Nietzsche would also criticize the shit out of that, because that was kind of his warning sign about science.
Science, he thought that the science
it's replaced religion. Like, we killed God. The famous quote from him is "God is dead," but really what he's saying is that we created God, we killed him.
Yeah, what are we gonna do?
And now what are we gonna do?
Yeah,
like, we're gonna be careful what you wish for.
Yeah,
kind of thing.
And he thought the scientists who ran around thinking they were so rational and everything that they did were also up to all kinds of strange things.
Right.
And we're ultimately subject to a lot of the same rules, and we're oftentimes more hypocritical and more delusional than the people who were, so-called religious. The other point was that the idea that, so there's this smart recovery, rational recovery, there's the God idea, but then also this idea that once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic is disturbing to some people. It's, that there's this idea, why do you have to go to those meetings for 20 years?
Right.
It's because I'm never cured of alcoholism.
Right. Because this thing's rooted in my mind.
It's sort of like almost original sin, perpetual state that cannot be overcome ultimately.
Right.
Right. It's a warped character. A warped piece of wood is a piece of wood that's been, changed by, water damage and can no longer be restored to its original shape. No
matter how much weight you put on it, or yeah.
And so with that, I wonder what Nietzsche would think of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Jung would have problems with that, because he would say that the psyche's like, just because you're diagnosed a paranoid schizophrenic doesn't mean you're going to be that forever. I think that's not the case anymore. I think most psychiatrists would be like, no, you're paranoid schizophrenic. Like, you need to take medication for the rest of your life, right?
Yeah.
But
which is what, the 12 steps would say the same thing. It's like this idea of a psychic change. The same person I didn't even recognize anymore. They came in and I met them and they looked completely different. It was only barely that I could recognize them as the person that I knew before, but in most other ways they were completely different.
Yeah.
So there's certainly this belief of a really essential, fundamental, deep change that can happen.
Well, and it's undeniable though. That's the problem. Like when you've been you've been in recovery for so many years, like you see, like even with our relationship, the guy I met, when you decided to go test the waters again, right? You still were the same Chris. You still had the same mind. You still had all the same stuff. Now maybe your coloring wasn't as good. You're probably a little bit more malnutrition, right? All that stuff, right? You didn't look like you were the happiest guy. But now, a couple years later, and it's like, oh yeah, there's that guy. It's almost like in Hook, when he doesn't know that he's Peter Pan, and then you find out that he's Peter Pan. He finds out he's like, oh, there you are, Peter, and it's like he's Peter Pan now.
Yeah, it's like the lights are on, but nobody's home.
Right. But you see that. You see
the lights turn on.
The lights turn on, and it's not even like the style or weight, but like the person just appears just healthier and more just boisterous and happy about life. And
I think one way, I don't know, Nietzsche might look at that is there's this sort of meeting reality. There's a very delusional, self-deceiving state that a really like in his cups active alcoholic addict is in. But ultimately we have to come to terms with reality. So that the 12 steps, there's all kinds of inventory, taking a look at oneself, rigorous honesty.
Yeah.
And then
but honesty is in the first step. So we kind of hash that out a little bit, right? And I mean, I think for another episode we'll do the inventory, because really, I mean, you and I've done, and we don't represent Alcoholics Anonymous or any of these, anonymous programs, but we've worked 12 steps in our life, and it's kind of a repeat: clean house, trust in God, and help others. That's kind of the reoccurring theme. So maybe that's how we chop it up with the Nietzsche analysis.
But I think with Nietzsche, ultimately the sort of new philosopher, he would see that as a very dangerous way to live. It's someone who meets reality, but then never lets up, and that he might think that ultimately within the 12 steps, you have this prescribed 12 commandments that you subject your life to. And ultimately, I think he would see a limit there. He would see that there's the select few, the real Ubermensch is a person who, even to their own personal detriment and destruction, like fearlessly continues to face and engage with reality as it is, and pull no punches, and put up no smoke screens.
Right.
When you stare into the abyss, the abyss stares back.
Right. Like put no limits. Put no limits on it, because maybe, 12 foundational principles that you live your life by, maybe a critique he could say would be like, they'll fail you eventually.
Maybe they're not right.
Yeah, maybe they're not the correct
Even if
way.
they produce good results, maybe they're false.
Right.
And that would be a very dangerous belief for someone who was involved in that
just
lifestyle.
like cults. Like if anything, it's almost like he's warning against cult. But what we're trying to say is that, well, yeah, these things are cults, but they're not bad cults.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and then you get into the whole thing, like, what's a good cult and what's a bad cult? Because could Christianity be called a cult? Probably. Yeah. Right? Like, but is it a good? It's probably a good cult.
And it's probably better to have a benign or a good cult over no cult.
Right, because no cult would be the state of nature, or it would be chaos, and
then there's no disciplining system.
Right.
To like through some Eastern philosophies, Advaita Vedanta, Ramana Maharshi, stuff like this, there was this idea that it's almost like your mind is like a fire that needs to burn itself out, and you stoke the fire with a stick, and at the very end you throw the stick into the fire until it's all gone, which would be like the sort of Buddhist nihilistic critique is what Nietzsche would put forward on that idea. But I think the idea that whatever philosophy it is, whether it's Stoicism or Neoplatonism or cynicism or Epicureanism, whatever it is, all of these things can be useful like a stick in order to sort of address things, but at the end of the day, we got to throw the stick into the fire. 12 steps, you know. But that's where I think it can be very dangerous. That's why I think we started this with this idea of, you know, Nietzsche ruining sobriety.
Right.
Because
but I think that's why me and you probably struggle with him a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, we have this love-hate relationship with this author. Just a quick example, like the first time I read Nietzsche, I almost started crying because it was just like, oh my God, I've never heard somebody so. And I've read a lot of different philosophers since then, but it was something with the internal recurrence theory actually, and I wanted to bring that up anyways. But this idea of like, imagine you live forever and your life is perpetuating. So would you make these decisions based on that? And it just hit me when I read that for the first time. I said, "Oh my God, I'm not living my life like that. I'm a failure." You know what I mean? The decisions I've made are horrible, right? Like I wouldn't want to relive those decisions 1,000 times, you know. And the way he described it, it killed me. And ever since then, I mean, that was many years ago. I've always messed with Nietzsche, you know, but he's just a you know.
Yeah.
And I think you feel the same thing.
Yeah, he would describe Socrates as like a gadfly on your neck. That's why he respected Socrates, even though there's a lot of his reading into his work. It feels like he's a huge critic of his.
He's a huge lover of him.
Yeah, because he talks about him so much. It's evidence of how much he admired him.
So does step one make it out of the Nietzschean? What do you think's the best way to frame it in Nietzschean? Giving as much credit as we can to him. The way I would take it is that through the lens of the internal recurrence theory and self-overcoming, right? He might look at it as a useful thing to do, right? A useful endeavor, with caution, maybe. But where else are you supposed to begin, right? Like not. And then the other thing that I think Nietzsche would probably really like about maybe step one would be the idea of this rigorous honesty, like really, really conceding to your innermost self that you have this problem. I think he would, because it doesn't just say admit to your innermost self. There's a point where it's like you have to concede to your innermost self.
There's almost this idea that,
right? That's
you know. We realized that the will to power was what was driving us, and our way of expressing that produced nothing but less and less power for ourselves.
Right, and maybe that's the lack of power is our dilemma.
And that was the state we were in.
Right, and we felt hopeless and restless and irritable.
We couldn't get out of this will to power.
Right,
and no matter how much we tried to will power, the less and less of it we had.
And the more we fall into like this idea of the slave morality maybe, or some kind of version of that.
Yeah. We realized that we were subjects of a slave morality, and that we wanted to be proponents of a master morality.
That sounds so.
I know
weird.
It's controversial
but that's the other thing that I think Nietzsche gets misinterpreted a lot, especially like with the whole Nazi thing and his sister, all that. We got into that last show, but there's this, like even something like whatever kills you or whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Like he's talking about a sick person. He's not talking about some Ubermensch guy. Yeah.
Do you want to be a taker or do you want to be a giver?
Right.
That would be a interpretation of, this isn't the first step exactly, but I think a taker is someone who is a subject of slave morality. Even though I guess you'd say a slave is someone who takes nothing and gives only. It's only things are taken from them. But he would see a slave as someone who views themselves as a victim, is resentful, is envious of others, and tries through every, deceptive means possible to try to get every scrap of self-esteem and power they can from those around them through any means necessary.
Right, and it makes it sound like it's just a bunch of power grub hungry scumbags.
Yeah.
And
which is how I think a lot of people would view newly or not sober alcoholics.
Right. Like the guy with the paper bag in his hand that, will rob you blind if you look the other way.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Selfishness and self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our problems.
Right.
Yeah.
But see, there's the other interpretation with selfishness and self-centeredness from a Nietzschean lens is he would say, like, yes, lean into the self. Like, he would not be he would be my interpretation is that he would be against saying, selfishness and self-centeredness bad. Mm-hmm. He would say, no, good.
Yeah.
Lean into it more.
And I think it would depend. It's like,
and that's where it gets really dangerous, right?
To the extent that the selfishness and the he might
is life affirming versus life denying.
Exactly.
Right.
He might have different. He would say that selfishness and self-centeredness is not always created equally, and sometimes he would almost probably make the argument that selfishness and self-centeredness is at play regardless
of anything.
Yeah. And it's whether it's being wielded in a life-affirming or a life-denying way, which is the problem.
Right.
It's whether it's being done, whether it's being employed by the slave or the master, that's the problem.
Yeah. So, I mean, it really doesn't make it out with a lot of bruises in it, step one, with through the lens of Nietzsche, just like anything would. Maybe we thought in our fucking noviceness that we could defend it, and I think we did a pretty good job, though. I mean, just reframing things. It's tough. He's a tough pill to swallow just on any concept.
Do you think Nietzsche drank?
I don't know any stories about it. I know he was in a cabin a lot alone.
Yeah, do you think he was tripping out there?
Was
he was wandering through the Swiss Alps? And
well, he loved art. Like he was a huge art critic and fan.
Yeah.
I mean, he wrote about music. He even wrote his own music.
Yeah. And poetry.
But he wrote poetry. I've heard some of his songs. You can actually.
Yeah, but do you think he was just tripping out there in the woods?
It sure seems
drinking some of that graveyard beer.
Having
his own little Eleusinian mysteries out there.
It's
possible. While he was convalescing.
It's possible, and is it possible that the state he was in with his perpetual, like, I think it was dysentery or sickness that he had, because he was sick a lot, right? It was like stomach issues that was putting him in a state of kind of tripping.
Because he had an infection, who knows?
Look at his mustache and everything. I mean, that was a heavy mustache.
I saw a guy with that mustache when I was in England.
That's hard.
Yeah. At Buckingham Palace, we were just walking around. There was tourists everywhere, and this fool walked by, and he had, like, legit, full-blown Nietzsche mustache.
Damn, that's heavy.
Yeah.
Like, how do you do that? Do you grow out all the way down, and then you have to start?
It's like, you got to be able to put up with it going way over your mouth.
Right, he goes way over his mouth, and it goes way out to the side.
He doesn't even go way over the side. It's like this.
It's just gnarly.
It's just like this.
Do you think that inspired Hitler?
I wonder. He's got like a real.
He is a German.
He has a real buttoned-up Nietzsche mustache.
That's interesting, but I think, maybe to finish it up, I think Nietzsche would just abjectly. Just dunk all over Nazis. He would say this is.
He would dunk over Nazis. He would dunk all over the 12 steps. But he would probably say that, 12-step.
Nice try.
People are doing better than a lot of others.
Right.
And he would probably say the Nazis are too.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It's like this idea of honesty, because he's got a really interesting idea of like what the truth really is, like capital T truth versus lowercase t truth, and he didn't invent that, but I'm just saying, like, he looks at truth as through the lens of like it really is just kind of will to knowledge, which is really just will to power. Like it's this will thing that we all have. We can't escape. There's no hiding from it. There's no.
It's just a matter of how we express it.
It's just a matter of how we express it in our day.
Levels of that.
Right. And then you could filter it through the lens of like what is more advantageous for you, what is more life affirming versus what's life denying.
And you in your personal life as opposed to you in your reputational life, in your historical life.
Yeah, historical life. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean,
what kind of waves do you make?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What kind of ripples can you create in the, what kind of disturbances can you make in the matrix? What kind of ripples can you put in the water?
Right. Well, that's why with the new philosopher argument that he has in what Genealogy of Morals, I think it is, or right, where he talks about the new philosopher, like that's kind of what the 12-step program is.
Yeah.
Full stop. It's the new philosophy, and it actually works.
And it is
really well.
big. It's like we killed God. What do we do?
Right.
The 12-step thing is it's taking what and I think Nietzsche would, in some respects, he was a big fan of Christianity. He would say that Western civilization wouldn't exist without it.
Right, of course. Yeah.
He would give the devil its due, to use maybe an ironic pun there. But, it's failed us. It's dogmatic. It's reached its limits. What are we going to do? The 12 steps is kind of like a hack. Through that little God as we understand it ingredient.
That's it.
It's sort of not completely thrown the whole set of values out, but it's sort of almost like a CRISPR DNA. It's taken the genome and it's just changed it in this one way.
Right.
That
it works really well. It works really well. It takes people that are literally, drug-induced psychosis, never will come back, never will be honest, to men of like good stature.
And it's potentially like you could make an argument that it's making an effort to be dogma-proof. Right, it's sort of a
very strong effort.
It's a doctrine that is self-defeating in some respects.
Right.
That is, that makes efforts to, we realize we know only a little. God of your own understanding. We could get into a lot of these other concepts.
Yeah. I think we will. Maybe
too.
For the next one, we'll do that. We'll do the God, because I'm very interesting. I'm trying to examine through Nietzsche's lens the idea of a God of our own understanding and humility, because he really rails against humility, and we didn't really get into that. We kind of into it the last show, but I think that's. What do you think? That's good for now.
That's good for now.
All right, everybody, have a good night.
You too.
All right, late.